Welcome to The Explainer. Today we're diving into a really important legal battle. It all started with one seafarer, a contract that was broken, and just a single line in a law that, believe it or not, stood to create a massive injustice for millions of Filipino workers overseas.
The work of overseas workers is absolutely vital. They power economies all over the world and support entire communities back home. But what happens when the very laws designed to protect them end up penalizing them, especially those with longer-term contracts?
And that's exactly the situation we're looking at today. This is the story of Antonio Serrano and his case against Gallant Maritime Services. It was a fight for what was rightfully his, and it became a fight that would challenge the law itself, going all the way to the Supreme Court. Okay, so let's set the scene. Back in March of 1998, a Filipino seafarer, Antonio Serrano, signs a 12-month contract with Gallant Maritime. This was supposed to be a year of stable work. But that promise, well, it was broken almost immediately. So this is where it all started to go wrong. Serrano was hired as a chief officer with a salary of $1,400 a month. But on the very day he's supposed to leave, the company basically corners him. They make him sign a new contract for a lower position, second officer, for only $1,000 a month, with a vague verbal promise that he'd get promoted quickly. So, did that promotion ever happen? Nope. After 2 months, the company still hadn't made good on its promise. Serrano refused to keep working in the demoted role, so they just sent him home. He'd only served a tiny fraction of his one-year contract. In legal terms, this is what's called constructive dismissal. It's when a company makes things so unbearable that an employee has no choice but to leave. That left almost 10 months on his contract completely unpaid. Serrano, believing he was illegally fired, filed a claim. And he wasn't asking for a settlement, he wanted the full amount, every single dollar he should have earned if the company had just honored its original agreement. But as he started his legal fight, he ran headfirst into a huge roadblock. It was a single clause in a law called the Migrant Workers Act, and it stood directly in his way. Now, you really have to pay attention to that last little phrase, whichever is less. This tiny clause created a massive problem. It set a hard cap on compensation. It meant that if you had a contract for, say, 2 years and were illegally fired, you could only get 3 months' worth of pay. That's it. No matter how much time was actually left on your deal. And this created a totally bizarre and, frankly, unfair system. I mean, look at this. A worker with a 10-month contract who gets fired gets paid for all 9 of his remaining months. But a worker with a longer 15-month contract who gets fired gets capped at just 3 months' pay. So the law was actually punishing people for securing longer, more stable jobs. It makes no sense, right? For Serrano, this step was absolutely devastating. He claimed over $25,000 for the rest of his contract term. But because of this law, the lower courts just chopped it down. They ended up awarding him just $4,200, which was exactly 3 months of his original promised salary. So this is where the case gets really interesting. It transforms from a simple money claim into a huge constitutional fight. Serrano didn't just appeal the amount. He took it all the way to the Supreme Court and argued that the 3-month cap itself was against the Constitution. The first major argument was just about basic fairness. Why on earth should 2 overseas workers, both illegally fired, get completely different levels of compensation just because one signed a 10-month contract and the other signed a 15-month one? It seemed like the law was creating 2 different classes of workers for no good reason at all. And this argument is grounded in a really important part of the Constitution, the Equal Protection Clause. It's a simple idea. The law is supposed to treat people in similar situations the same way. Serrano's lawyers argued that Section 10 violated this principle by drawing an arbitrary line in the sand. The second big challenge raised another fundamental question. Think about it. Your salary, guaranteed by a contract, is your property. So can the government just step in and say you're not entitled to a huge chunk of it? Especially without a really, really good reason. This gets into a legal concept called substantive due process. It's not just about whether a law was passed correctly, it's about whether the law itself is fair and serves a legitimate purpose. The government can't just take away fundamental rights without a very solid justification. Now, because this law affected laborers, a group that the Constitution specifically says needs special protection, the Supreme Court decided to bring out the big guns. They applied their toughest test, called strict judicial scrutiny.
This completely flips the script. Instead of the law being presumed valid, it was presumed unconstitutional. The burden was now entirely on the government to prove that this law was absolutely necessary.
So the stage was set. This was going to be a landmark decision, one that would completely reshape labor rights for overseas workers. And the Supreme Court's verdict? It was clear, it was decisive, and it was a total game changer. That clause, the one limiting compensation to just 3 months' salary, was officially struck down. It was declared unconstitutional. So, what was the core reason behind this powerful decision? Well, what lawyers call the ratio decidendi was all about social justice. The court pointed straight to the Constitution's promise of full protection to labor and said that any law that harms this group has to meet the absolute highest legal standard. And the law failed that strict test big time. First, the court said it created an unfair classification between workers. Then, the government argued that the cap was needed to protect recruitment agencies from going bankrupt. But the court shot that down completely, ruling that protecting a private business is not a compelling state interest that justifies taking away a worker's constitutional rights. And the disposition of the case? A complete win for Serrano. The Supreme Court ordered the company to pay him for the entire unexpired part of his contract. So instead of that tiny $4,200 reward, he received what he was owed for the remaining 9 months and 23 days, a much, much larger amount. So why are we still talking about this one case today? What's the lasting legacy here for millions of Filipinos working abroad? Well, the Serrano ruling established a powerful legal doctrine. It basically leveled the playing field. It made it crystal clear that if an overseas worker is dismissed without just cause, they get paid for their entire unexpired contract, period. It also sent a huge message. The rights of workers can't just be traded away to protect business interests. In the end, the Serrano case tore down a legal wall that was deeply unfair. But it also leaves us with a really important question to think about. As our world and our economy keep changing, what more needs to be done to make sure that the promise of full protection to labor isn't just a phrase in a book, but a real lived experience for every single worker?